She called him a supreme friend, those 3 words written in an email. Sent privately, never intended for public consumption, and now blazing across headlines around the world, attached permanently to a name that has spent decades trying to escape the gravitational pull of one association that simply will not let go. Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess of York, the woman who was once described as a breath of fresh air when she married into the most famous family in the world. The woman who survived the toe-sucking photographs and the cash for access sting and the financial chaos and the multiple very public reinventions. The woman who had, just a few years ago, begun to feel like someone who had genuinely managed to pull off the impossible. Someone who had come back from the kind of reputational damage that should have been terminal and built something new, and something that people were beginning to accept on its own terms. And now this supreme friend, in an email to Jeffrey Epstein, written at a time when she had publicly claimed to have severed all contact with him, surfacing in a document release by the United States Department of Justice and spreading through the global media with the speed and the force of something that was always going to land exactly this badly. The aftermath has been swift, and it has been severe. The charities are gone, the honorary titles are stripped, the Austrian sanctuary, the wellness retreat at £2,000 per night that was her most recent attempt to find some ground stable enough to stand on, has been blown. The photographs emerged showing exactly where she was and she left, and now she is reportedly moving between borrowed accommodation provided by wealthy friends, somewhere in Europe, out of sight and out of reach of the cameras that would photograph her and the journalists who would ask the questions she does not want to answer. This is the most exposed and the most precarious position Sarah Ferguson has been in since the worst periods of the 90s. Possibly since ever. Today we are going to examine all of it, the email and what it reveals, the document release and what it contained, the organizations that have walked away, the financial questions that have returned, the Austrian retreat and why it ended, where she is now and who is funding it, and the larger question that sits beneath all of these individual details. Is this simply another storm that Sarah Ferguson will eventually survive and emerge from with yet another reinvention, or is this the chapter that finally and permanently closes the book on the public version of the woman who was once the world's most famous duchess? Let's go through it properly. First, let's talk about the document release, because context matters and the specific sequence of events that led to the Supreme Friend email becoming public is important for understanding why this particular moment has landed with such force. The United States Department of Justice released a further tranche of previously sealed documents in late January. This was not the first document release connected to the Epstein network. It was one in a series that has been ongoing for some time, but each release adds new material. New specificity, new detail that complicates or expands or in some cases fundamentally alters the picture that previous releases had established. This particular release included emails between Ferguson and Epstein. Among them, an email in which she apologized to him, and in which she described him in terms that she clearly intended as warm and personal rather than as a public statement, as a supreme friend, the 3 words that have now defined this phase of her story. Now let's be precise about what those words do and do not mean in the legal context. The articles reporting on the document release were explicit that the emails themselves did not indicate any form of wrongdoing on Ferguson's part. The email is evidence of a friendship maintained and of warmth expressed. It is not in itself evidence of criminal conduct. That distinction matters legally. But in the court of public opinion, in the specific arena where Sarah Ferguson has always been tried and where her reputation has always been determined, legal precision is not the primary currency. What matters is perception. What matters is the gap between what she said publicly and what she wrote privately. What matters is the phrase itself and what it reveals about how she actually understood and felt about a man that the world knew by the time she wrote it to be a convicted sex offender. Supreme friend, not acquaintance. Not occasional contact, not someone she knew through professional channels and maintained minimal necessary communication with, a supreme friend. A word that implies the highest category, the most valued, the most trusted. The most cherished, that is what the email reveals, not necessarily criminal conduct, but a closeness, a warmth, a personal regard that is completely and irreconcilably inconsistent with the public position she had maintained, with the statements about having severed contact, with the narrative of having learned from her mistakes and moved on. The gap between the public claim and the private reality is the damage, and it is, in terms of what it communicates about the reliability of anything she says in her own defense, considerable. Let's talk about the specific other details in the document release. Because the Supreme Friend email was not the only relevant material, there were also reports that Ferguson had taken her daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, to visit Epstein after his release from prison. The specific timing, as has been discussed extensively in earlier coverage, is what makes this detail so troubling. Not simply that the visit happened, but when it happened, days after Epstein's release from a Florida prison following his 2008 conviction. Days, not months or years, into some period during which the world might have developed more ambiguous information about him. Days after a conviction that was public record and that established clearly and legally who and what he was. And Ferguson brought her daughters, the daughters who are now in their mid-30s and who are paying, as one expert put it, the price for choices that were never theirs. Beatrice was in her early 20s at the time of that visit. Eugenie was 19, old enough to form their own judgments, yes, but also old enough to trust their mothers. Old enough to assume that the adults making decisions about where they went and who they saw had assessed the situations correctly and had their best interests at heart. That assumption has proven costly, not through anything the daughters did, but through the specific circumstances of who their mother chose to maintain a friendship with and how she chose to manage that friendship in relation to the public statements she was making about it. Now let's talk about the organizational response, because the speed and the completeness of the institutional walkaway from Ferguson is itself a significant part of this story. Julius House, the children's hospice that had appointed her as patron, gone. Their statement described continuing the relationship as inappropriate, not merely unfortunate or inconvenient, inappropriate. The Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, gone. Prevent breast cancer, gone. The Children's Literacy Charity, gone. The British Heart Foundation, gone. 5 organizations. In the space of weeks, each one issuing some form of statement, in some cases very brief, in others more detailed, to the effect that the association could no longer be maintained. Now, let's think about what this tells us. Charities are conservative institutions by temperament and by necessity. They understand that their ability to operate, to raise funds, to maintain donor confidence, to recruit volunteers, to deliver services, depends entirely on their reputation, on the public's trust in them, on the belief that the organizations carrying their name are associated with causes and people that the public respects. When charities begin to leave, not just one quietly with minimum publicity, but several publicly in rapid succession, it signals something specific. That the association with Ferguson has crossed a threshold, that the risk of being seen to maintain the connection outweighs in the charity's calculation any benefit that the connection provided. For organizations like these, the Hospice, the Cancer Trust, the Heart Foundation, the benefit of a royal adjacent patron is primarily reputational. The name opens doors, the association signals legitimacy, the public profile of the patron generates coverage and therefore awareness and therefore potentially donations. But if the patron's own reputation is so damaged that the association generates the wrong kind of coverage, if being connected to Ferguson now means being connected to the Epstein documents and the Supreme Friend email and everything that has come out, then the association becomes a liability rather than an asset. And charitable organizations, which exist to serve their beneficiaries rather than to provide prestigious roles for controversial public figures, will make the commercially rational and institutionally correct decision to protect their own reputations. The 5 departures in that context were predictable. And they were swift, which tells you that in each case the decision was not difficult, that the conclusion reached by each organization's leadership was not the product of extended agonizing, but of a relatively immediate assessment that the situation had become untenable. Then there is the freedom of the City of York, the honorary designation that was voted on unanimously by the city's councillors, removed. With no abstentions, not a single representative in the chamber willing to be the dissenting voice, not one person who thought the calculation might come out differently. mathematical consensus in the direction of removal, this deserves some examination, because the freedom of a city is not a major institutional designation in the way that a royal patronage or a charity role is. It does not carry significant practical consequences, it does not fund anything or enable anything or provide Ferguson with a platform that she could not access through other means, but it carries symbolic weight. And symbolic weight, as has been observed in this coverage many times, matters in the specific world of royal life and public standing. The symbolic removal of recognition, the formal act of a city retracting an honor it had previously extended, is a statement. It says, "We associated ourselves with this person and we are now choosing formally and publicly to unassociate." The unanimity of the vote amplifies the statement. Nobody was willing to argue for retention. Nobody thought the cost of being seen to vote against removal was worth paying. The political class of York at the local level made a collective decision about the value of the Ferguson association that was unambiguous and that did not require deliberation. That kind of institutional consensus, reached quickly and without dissent, is a significant indicator of where public and political sentiment has settled. Now let's talk about the Austrian retreat. Because the story of the Mayo Life Wellness Spa and the 213 days before she was photographed there and the departure that followed the exposure is one of the most revealing episodes in this entire period of her story. 213 days, from her last public appearance in the UK, the christening of her granddaughter Athene, to the moment she was photographed at the Austrian facility. That is not a brief period of avoiding cameras. That is a sustained, deliberate, carefully maintained disappearance from any public record of her existence. She was at the Mayo Life Wellness Spa near Salzburg, a high-end medical retreat known specifically for its luxury treatments and its strict privacy protocols. The reported cost was £2,000 per night, approximately £14,000 per week. The facility appeals specifically to wealthy international guests willing to pay premium prices for discretion. She was not mingling, not using the communal spaces, not walking through the lobby or sitting by the pool in the way that guests who are simply relaxing would do. She was inside her private suite, ordering room service to avoid the dining areas where she might be recognized, deliberately staying out of any shared space where another guest or a member of staff might see her and connect the face to the name. She was trying to exist inside the resort without being present in it, to benefit from the privacy and the safety and the specific quality of care the facility offered while remaining entirely invisible to its other inhabitants. That strategy worked. Until it didn't, once photographs emerged, showing irrefutable evidence of her presence at the specific facility, the arrangement collapsed. The sanctuary was no longer a sanctuary because sanctuaries only remain sanctuaries when their location remains unknown. Once the location was published and the photographs distributed, the carefully constructed privacy that had made the resort valuable to her was gone. She left, reportedly shortly after the exposure, and began reaching out to her network of wealthy friends for alternative accommodation. The funding question, let's address it directly and honestly. How was the Austrian stay funded? £14,000 per week at minimum, for a period that extended over multiple weeks, possibly months, based on the timeline of her movements. The total cost, even for a relatively brief stay, would be substantial by any measure. The honest answer is that it is genuinely unclear. The reporting describes uncertainty about the source of the funding. Royal commentator Tom Sykes was quoted in the Daily Beast making the observation that the very idea of Sarah Ferguson financing this stay entirely from her own personal resources strains credibility. That is a pointed but accurate observation. Her documented financial history does not suggest accumulated personal wealth of a scale that would make this kind of expenditure comfortable or routine. The debts of the 90s, the continued financial pressures documented across subsequent years, the multiple commercial ventures that have not produced sustained financial stability, the dissolved companies, the closed charities, the lost title that was the commercial foundation of her public identity. Against that background, £14,000 per week at a luxury wellness retreat requires explanation. The possibilities, as they emerge from the available reporting, are several: personal resources that are less depleted than her documented history suggests, support from wealthy friends whose generosity is not commercially motivated but simply personal, a connection to funds that are not straightforwardly hers, but that she has access to through her network of international contacts, or some combination of all of these. The publishing circle's speculation about a memoir deal adds another layer. If a commercial project of sufficient scale is in negotiation or in preparation, the expectation of income might create conditions under which expenses could be sustained in advance of the payment arriving, living toward a deal, in other words, rather than from existing resources. Whatever the specific mechanism, the basic situation, a woman with documented financial difficulties staying in a £14,000 per week retreat and then moving between borrowed accommodation provided by wealthy friends raises questions that the available information does not fully answer. Let me talk about what this particular moment means in the context of the broader arc of her story, because it is useful to have some historical perspective on where this fits in the long and turbulent public life of Sarah Ferguson. She has been here before, not exactly here, not with this specific combination of Epstein emails and unanimous civic removals and 5 charity departures in rapid succession, but in the general territory of severe reputational damage following a specific revelatory moment, the kind of moment that appears from the inside like it might be the one that finally and permanently ends the story, the toe-sucking photographs of 1992. Published global headlines, the kind of humiliation that most people in public life do not recover from. And yet she recovered the cash for access sting of 2010, hidden camera footage of her apparently offering to sell access to Prince Andrew for £500,000. Broadcast globally, an apology issued, a promise of having learned from it made publicly. And yet she recovered. Each recovery involved some combination of time, reinvention, commercial productivity, and the specific quality that those who know her most consistently identify: an almost miraculous capacity to absorb public punishment and reconstitute herself on the other side of it. To find the next chapter when the current one has appeared to definitively close, the question being asked right now by royal watchers and by those who have covered her career over decades is whether this moment is different in kind rather than simply in degree from the previous ones. Whether the specific nature of the current damage, the Epstein email, the sustained proximity to the most toxic scandal associated with the royal family, the systematic loss of charitable associations and civic honors, has closed the routes of reinvention that were available after previous moments. Here is why this moment might be different, and I want to be honest about this rather than simply reassuring. The previous recoveries relied on a gap. A gap between the public perception of the damage and the full truth of what had happened. The toe-sucking photographs were embarrassing, but they were not evidence of ongoing problematic associations. The cash for access sting was devastating, but it was possible to frame it as a momentary lapse of judgment rather than a sustained pattern. The Supreme Friend email closes the gap because the email makes it impossible to maintain the framing that the Epstein association was peripheral, occasional, limited to a specific period before the full picture of his crimes became clear. The email was written after the conviction, after the public disclosure of who and what he was, after her stated public commitment to having severed the relationship, and it describes him as a supreme friend. The gap between the public statement and the private reality in this case is total and documented. That documentation is what makes the current moment different from previous ones, because in previous moments the gap could be bridged, the narrative could be adjusted. The public could be offered a version of events that, while not entirely comfortable, was at least internally consistent and at least plausibly authentic. The email does not permit that. It is there. In the document's specific, dated, in her own words, calling him a supreme friend, written after she had publicly claimed the friendship was over. The credibility deficit that creates the specific damage done to the reliability of anything she subsequently says in her own defense is not something that another memoir or another television appearance or another carefully managed rehabilitation campaign can simply address, because the audience for any future account she produces will read it knowing that she has publicly said one thing and privately written something entirely different. That is the specific and unprecedented quality of her current difficulty. Let me talk about Andrew, because the reporting around Ferguson's situation raises a question that a number of observers have noted as conspicuous by its absence: if Ferguson is relying on wealthy friends for accommodation. If her situation is as precarious as the available reporting suggests, if the person she has spent 30 years being closest to, the man who was her husband and remained her closest companion after the divorce, is at Marsh Farm in Norfolk, why is he not being presented as the obvious and available resource? The reports do not directly answer this, and the absence of that answer is itself a piece of information. The most obvious possibility is that the public dimension of whatever arrangement they make has become more carefully managed. That a visible return to the shared domestic arrangements of Royal Lodge, the arrangement that was ended when he was moved to Wood Farm and then to Marsh Farm, would generate a specific kind of coverage that neither of them in their current situations can afford. A photograph of Ferguson arriving at Marsh Farm to take up residence with Andrew would produce headlines that are the opposite of what each of them needs right now. For Andrew, it would reinforce the story of a man whose situation has not meaningfully changed. For Ferguson, it would undermine any attempt to maintain even the appearance of the separation that various observers have described as a PR move rather than a genuine one. The silence about Andrew's role in her current situation is probably not because he is irrelevant to it. It is because making his role visible would create problems that the silence avoids. Let me talk about what the next chapter looks like in practical terms, because the question that follows all of this detail is the simple and urgent one: what does she do now? Option 1, the memoir, the tell-alls. The commercial project that would generate the kind of income that makes everything else sustainable. The 7 or 8 figure deal that changes the financial reality and provides the platform for whatever version of her story she chooses to tell. This option is reportedly in discussion. The publishing circle's speculation about a memoir deal is consistent with the pattern of her previous responses to crisis, the turn toward commercial storytelling as the mechanism for financial recovery and narrative control simultaneously. The obstacle is not the willingness, it is the market. Tom Sykes's observation about publishing circles indicates that the appetite for the project is not uniform, that some publishers are reluctant to attach their imprint to anything that will inevitably generate Epstein-connected coverage, that the Supreme Friend email has made the commercial calculation more complex rather than simpler. But memoirs of this kind do eventually find publishers. The appetite for the inside story of this particular family at this particular moment in its history is not absent from the market, it is present. The question is whether the specific terms, the financial advance, the editorial control, the timing and framing, can be agreed in a way that produces both the commercial outcome Ferguson needs and the institutional risk assessment that any publisher will perform. Option 2, the interview. The opera moment equivalent, the sit-down with a major broadcaster or platform that allows her to present her own version of events directly to a global audience. This has been discussed. The figures being quoted suggest the appetite from media organizations is real. The obstacle, again, is the specific nature of the questions that any journalist worth their salary will ask. Questions that the Supreme Friend email makes considerably harder to navigate than they would have been before its publication. Option 3, managed retreat, continued invisibility. The acceptance, however temporary, that the storm is too severe to engage with directly and that the best available strategy is patience. Time, the expectation that the news cycle will eventually move elsewhere and that some version of a space to breathe will re-emerge. This option has the advantage of not creating new material for the coverage, but it requires resources for the borrowed accommodation, for the basic necessities of a life lived at the level she considers minimum, that depend on the continued willingness and ability of wealthy friends to provide them. Option 4. Something unexpected, something that does not fit neatly into the available categories. Ferguson has surprised people before. Has found paths through that were not visible from the outside. The corgi cloning television project, however quickly denied, was evidence of lateral thinking about how to translate her specific assets into commercial opportunities. The next surprising idea may already be in development. Let me think about what this moment means for Beatrice and Eugenie, because they are always implicated, always affected, always paying a portion of the cost of whatever their mother does or whatever emerges about her. They are in constant contact with her, according to the reports. Concerned about the effect of the recent events on her mental health and emotional well-being, maintaining the familial support that has characterized their relationship with both parents throughout all the previous crises, that loyalty is genuine. It is also costly. Every time they are visibly supportive of Ferguson, every public appearance that can be connected to their mother's story, every statement of family solidarity that might be made, they risk being pulled back into the coverage they have spent months carefully stepping out of. The institutional pressure on them from the palace side of their lives is toward distance from anything connected to the York scandal. The personal pressure from the family side is toward maintaining the connections that have always been central to who they are. Those two pressures are, as they have always been in this period, pulling in opposite directions. The reports indicate they are choosing to remain supportive of their mother privately while maintaining the public distance that their own situations require. The constant contact that sources describe is not public, it is happening beneath the media surface, in the spaces that cameras do not reach. In the specific way that family connection operates when the family members in question have learned that too much public demonstration of that connection creates problems. It is a kind of love that has had to learn to operate quietly, that has had to adapt to circumstances that make the ordinary expressions of family loyalty, being visibly present, demonstrating support, showing up, into choices with consequences that go beyond the personal. That is its own form of quiet heartbreak. Let me spend some time on the image, the specific image that the reporting creates of where Sarah Ferguson is right now, and what it represents relative to where she has been 213 days after last being seen publicly in the UK, moving between borrowed accommodations. Inside a £2,000 per night retreat, ordering room service, avoiding the communal spaces where she might be recognised, then fleeing that retreat when the photographs emerged, now somewhere in Europe in borrowed space out of sight. Contrast that with the image of the woman who arrived on the royal scene in 1986, loud, energetic. Front pages for entirely different reasons. The charismatic redhead who broke rules and pushed boundaries and charmed crowds and generated attention of the kind that the press of that era loved. The woman who built a second act through television and books and personality-driven ventures, and who was, in her prime, one of the most recognized figures in the world. The woman who called the Austrian resort her sanctuary, one of the only places in the entire world where she could simply be Sarah, just herself. Now that sanctuary is gone too, compromised by the exposure left behind when the photographs emerged. Another version of the safe place that has proven not to be safe. There is something almost unbearably sad about that specific detail. The place that was the only place where she could simply be herself, not the Duchess, not the former Duchess, not the Ferguson of the headlines and the Epstein documents and the Supreme Friend email, but just a person. And even that has been taken away by the cameras that found her and the publication that ran the photographs and the mechanism of attention that she spent her entire public life both seeking and being consumed by. She is now somewhere that we do not know. In space borrowed from people whose continued willingness to provide it depends on their own assessment of whether the association is one they can manage, without a title, without a home. Without the charitable structures that gave her work its shape, without the Austrian sanctuary, in contact with her daughters but unable to be visible about that contact. Possibly in preparation for the commercial project that will fund the next chapter, possibly simply waiting, it is a remarkable and difficult place to be. For someone who was once, in the most literal sense, a princess, now let me address the central question that this story poses, and I want to answer it honestly rather than with false reassurance or unwarranted pessimism. Is this the end of Sarah Ferguson as a significant public figure, or is this another storm that she will eventually survive and from which she will emerge with some version of yet another reinvention? My honest assessment is this. Sarah Ferguson has demonstrated, across 4 decades of public life, an almost unique capacity for survival, for finding ways through situations that appeared terminal, for reconstituting herself on the other side of damage that would have ended the careers of most comparable public figures. But the specific nature of the current damage is different. the Supreme Friend email does something to her credibility that previous scandals did not. It creates a documented gap between her public statements and her private reality that cannot be explained away, cannot be framed sympathetically, and cannot be made consistent with any version of the rehabilitation narrative that worked after previous crises. The rehabilitation narratives after previous crises all relied on the public's willingness to believe that Ferguson had been honest about what happened and what she learned from it, that she told us the truth about the mistake and about the change in direction it produced. The email demonstrates that she was not honest. That at the same time as she was publicly claiming to have severed the Epstein connection, she was privately describing him in the warmest possible terms, that the public promise was false and the private reality was different. Once that specific form of dishonesty is documented, the rehabilitation path closes. Not because the public is unwilling to forgive, the public is generally quite willing to forgive, but because forgiveness and trust are different things. The public can forgive Sarah Ferguson for her association with Epstein and the specific choices she made in relation to it. Forgiveness is possible. Trust, the specific trust required for a rehabilitation narrative to work, requires the belief that the account being offered is honest. And the email makes that belief unavailable. What comes next for her is therefore not a traditional rehabilitation, it is something different. Either a confrontation with the full truth of her situation, an account that is honest rather than managed, that acknowledges the gap between the public claim and the private reality, that accepts the specific responsibility she bears, or a life lived in the margins, sustained by borrowed accommodation and the goodwill of wealthy friends, and whatever commercial projects do not require the specific credibility that the email has compromised. The first path is harder. More painful, more personally costly, but it is the only path that leads to something real. The second path is the path of managed retreat, of the kind of invisibility she is currently practicing, of drifting between borrowed sanctuaries until some combination of time and circumstance produces a different set of options. Let me close by thinking about what this moment reveals, not just about Ferguson, but about the specific way that the British public and British institutions relate to the people who are connected to the royal family. Sarah Ferguson was taken in by the royal family. Given a title, a life, a set of associations that shaped who she became, and then, when the marriage ended and the institutional connection frayed and the specifically royal support was withdrawn, she was left to make her own way with the habits and expectations that royal life had installed without the resources that royal life had provided. This is a pattern. Not unique to Ferguson, the specific formation of identity inside a powerful institution, followed by the specific difficulty of functioning outside it when the connection ends. Ferguson's response to that difficulty, the commercial reinvention, the sponsored content, the memoirs and the television appearances and the Weight Watchers campaigns, and all the various ways she attempted to translate the only asset she still reliably possessed, her name and her story, into sustainable income, was understandable. Even admirable in a specific way, the sheer energy of the attempt, the refusal to simply disappear quietly. But the path that began with those understandable attempts eventually led through choices that were less understandable, less defensible, choices that have produced the current moment. And the current moment is this: a woman whose title is gone, whose charitable associations are gone, whose shared home is gone, whose Austrian sanctuary is gone, who is moving between borrowed accommodations in Europe, whose daughters are in constant contact with her out of genuine concern for her well-being, whose story has not ended but whose current chapter offers very little of the warmth and color and energy that characterized her at her best, the Supreme Friend. Those three words, written in private, surfacing in the documents, defining this moment, and leaving Sarah Ferguson for the first time in a very long time without an obvious or immediate answer to the question that has always defined her: what comes next? That is everything for today, a story that is still unfolding, that has further to go. That will produce more chapters before it reaches any version of a conclusion. If you are not yet subscribed, please do it now. It is completely free, and this story requires consistent attention because the developments are coming faster than most people are tracking. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Sarah Ferguson is capable of another genuine reinvention after the Supreme Friend email? Do you have sympathy for her position, or do you think the specific choices she made, particularly maintaining the private correspondence while publicly claiming to have severed contact, place the responsibility for her current situation firmly on her own shoulders? And what do you think comes next? Thank you for watching.